But, when I think back to 2020, I have to wonder, like it's going to be remembered for many, many things. There were locust outbreaks all across Africa. This is biblical in nature, if you will. Of course, the pandemic that we're living with consistently, and it's impacting our lives on a minute by minute basis, it seems like. But I often look back and recognize 2020 as also a year of mega fires, if you will, really significant. And if you can remember back to early, late 2019 and early 2020, much of the news was dominated by the fires that were occurring all across Australia, and they were ultimately an area the size of the state of Washington burned in Australia. And some of those ecosystems, I was in contact with, some colleagues, friends that Dave Hibb knows as well. And they were saying that ecosystems down there, like our redwood ecosystems, were burning. And that's the loss that they were experiencing. And of course, we thought we were sort of getting through fire season, I guess less scathed or unscathed here in Oregon until Labor Day came. And, this is just a picture of my backyard, looking at the smoke that we were ingesting here in the Willamette Valley. And we certainly experienced, something that, some people might say we know about and we have expected that, and it's certainly documented in the science, but it's such a rare event that it's highly impactful for many reasons. And it's really surprising. And as a fire scientist, I too was surprised, and I probably shouldn't have been, but undoubtedly I was. I hear somebody speaking. All right, getting some funny feedback. But I was surprised. So let's look back in time. So, I say we fire scientists.
Chris, you're muted.
Yeah.
Now you're fine. Sorry about that.
Did I get muted?
You did, but now you're not. I was trying to get everyone to be quiet, and it made you quiet too. So.
Well, you might want me to be quiet by the end of this, so that's a good tool to have. So think, this is just my backyard, and I'll just move on. And I just want to give you a little bit of history from what we can find even in just our newspapers, not data rich, coming out of the Oregonian. There's old articles, and this is 1883, and this is actually the Oregon Sentinel down in Southwest Oregon at the time. But you can see here a great forest fire in the Cascades, consuming thousands of acres, animals running wild that infest the region. Other cases of reading about these fires occurring down there. Superintendent Griffin, with usual promptness, first ran the gauntlet of fire and reported it safe to proceed with the train. And the lad pulled it through its 70-mile rate of speed without damage. Here in the Oregonian in 1857, the atmosphere was so thoroughly loaded with smoke from vast fires in the coast and Cascade ranges of mountains as to create a sort of distemper. Persons affected were troubled with labored breathing, slight cough, and mucus expectoration. And much of this sickness continues to prevail. And here we are in 1964, volumes of smoke. And I think my favorite of all of these in 1867, we read about Egyptian darkness, but it is smoke and Josephine smoke. Smoke in the morning, at noon, at night. Meet a neighbor, it is smoke. Parting from one, it is smoke. Hogs running around are smoked through and through live, running bacon. So you see, we live in the days of smoke. It is smoke, smoke, smoke. Back in 1867. If we could look at 2017, 2018, we can see, maybe an increasing trend of fires, but nonetheless, 450,000 acres, 846,000 acres. And in 2020, we just crested over 1 million acres burning in the state of Oregon. Pretty significant, but not unprecedented. We look back to the Aquina fire of 1857 at 480,000 acres, and the Siletz and Silverton fires, much near and dear to the area we are at up here in northwestern Oregon, single fires approaching almost 1 million acres. Very significant, but very rare, infrequent occurrences across northwestern Oregon. And so, the fires and the experiences that we had are not necessarily unprecedented, but they are rare. And so they have that feeling and that effect as if they are unprecedented and we're experiencing something new. And many of us are experiencing something new, but it's not necessarily new. Now, as I was saying before, even I was surprised by these events, and I study fire and think about fire on a daily basis, but it's just still so rare and rare to our personal experiences that most of us were caught off guard for this potential, despite having a history of experiencing this, and a history even in as recently as 1950s, coming out of 1933 all the way up into the 50s of the Tillamook burn, and the subsequent burns that occurred around that area. So, certainly history presents itself that this can occur, but we haven't seen it since, these dates. So it's been approaching almost 70 years since we've experienced as a community here in Oregon something so significant. But we did experience it in 2020. And so I just want to give a little context as to how the stage was set and what really drove those events that have really affected our communities at large. So here's just a look at the drought index. On the left, it's for August, and on the right, it's for September. And August is probably the more relevant one here because we did get that rain in September, much needed at that time. That really helped us with those fires. But preceding that, we were experiencing a drought, moderate drought here, even in Western Oregon. And from a fire perspective and a fire potential perspective, the outlooks were really looking pretty bleak for much of Western Oregon, of course, all the way down into California. And this was actually very reflective of the outcomes that we did experience. And so there was some prediction of this potential across the landscapes. It set the stage, if you will. So the stage was set for something extreme to happen. But that the extremeness of this event was really driven by those east winds that we experienced. And so a little context about east winds, there's a couple things that really come with that, and it's dry winds and it's strong winds. And those are really precipitated by high pressure systems sitting over the interior Pacific Northwest. So sitting, just east of the Cascade Crest, you get a high pressure system sitting there. And that high pressure wants to disseminate its energy into the low pressures off the coast. So typically we see that onshore flow that brings in moisture and high humidities coming off the Pacific Ocean. When you see that inverted and we experience the dry conditions of Eastern Oregon, manifested over here in Western Oregon because of the way the wind is blowing in these events. And as that wind column is compressed over the Cascades, as it gets over the top of it and it opens up into what becomes the Willamette Valley, it releases a lot of that energy, and that compression causes the wind to increase. And so as it dumps over to Western Oregon, it's much greater speed with that dryness. And the forest and our ecosystems were already in a dry state. So the stage was set, and then the conditions manifest. And they manifest in this series of slides that I'm going to show you next, which is the jet stream and the wind vectors that drive. And so on the left, you'll see the typical weather jet stream and wind vectors that you might see on a weather report. And on the right will be a satellite imagery that shows you the smoke and the clouds and how those are moving around. And there'll be a lot of red dots, which are existing wildfires across the Western United States. And I'll take you through a series of these just to see how that impacted the fires that were occurring or impacted the fires that ignited during that event and continued to grow. And we'll just step through those together and look at them. So here's September 5th, right? So September 5th, this is somewhat of a normal flow of the jet stream. It's pretty high in north, but it's just pushing, those moist winds off the Pacific Ocean. And you can see that the fires and the smoke coming off of those fires, dominantly in California, we're moving to the northeast. And that's a typical onshore flow that we experience here in the Western United States. But as the days progressed, we see this weather front coming and we start to see a bend in this weather stream. And then you can see it on September 6th, and it really starts to bend down the ridge of the Rockies. And you can see this huge bend. So here's, now September 7th. And you can see now in those fires and the smoke coming off of that they're starting to move to the southeast, and it's starting to follow how that high pressure system is pushing winds now from the east out to the ocean as it sets in over the Cascades and in eastern Oregon and Washington. And essentially you'll see this jet stream dip even farther, and it really runs from the Canadian border all the way down to the Mexican border. It's a huge event. But what was interesting is watching this sort of onset, and I'm communicating with colleagues of mine in Oregon or in Colorado, and family I have in Colorado, about what they're experiencing, because they were experiencing significant fires, and they're sending me images that look like this. And so this is Colorado, and it's one of the weirdest forecasts I've ever seen, where it's just fire, snow, and it's just complete mayhem. And even with this snow event, ultimately, the snow event ultimately didn't even suppress their fires, and one of those fires around Fort Collins continued to burn all the way into November, and made some additional significant runs there in Colorado. So my attention had turned to this because I just thought this was such a fascinating forecast. Meanwhile, things were setting up here in Oregon for something massive and destructive, and so I just like to bring this up because we have risk perceptions and we think about these potential events, and even those of us that are embedded in it were caught off guard and surprised. We had a fire up in the Cascades, and there was no calls for mass evacuations despite this potential. And it's just human nature that we sort of think this way. And I even had my attention turned, and yet we had this massive event set up, as you can see here, over the Rocky Mountains. And that really was the high pressure setting in there, and it just instantly shifted those winds to the east, brought in those dry conditions that I was discussing, resulted in some additional ignitions from a lot of infrastructure, power lines primarily, and new fires that spread very rapidly and unabated by any efforts that firefighters or others tried to implement. And you can see that huge smoke column just dump. And it's all the way across the West Coast, really, where we see smoke blowing out now to the ocean. And it was really driven by these wind events. And so by September 19th, we can see we're now inundated with these major fire events burning. September 10th, and we all lived this and we all experienced this in some way here in Oregon. September 11th, we're still under it. And that ultimately is where the shift begins. And so I dropped the wind vector map, and we can just watch the smoke as this additional front pushed in off the coast. And that's, as we were inundated by smoke, particularly up here in the Willamette Valley, it eventually was starting to clear in pretty rapid order. And because there was so much smoke and a large inversion, once that east winds really subsided, the fire spread just really shut down. Ultimately the increase after that wind event was very, very minimal relative to the large fires that were on our landscapes. And you can just see that ultimately we're just back into it, and we got some rain, and that helped sort of quell it finally. And then we were able to start to consider, what do we do now? How do we recover from this event? And so stepping into just a little bit more specificity about the Beachy Creek and the Lion's Head, most close to us up here in the Corvallis area, the Willamette Valley area. Of course, there were other fires, Archie Creek down south, and then we had the Holiday Farm fire and the Riverside fire north of these, burning simultaneously, as well as some other ones. And we'll see some images of all of those. But here we are, just stepping back to the more local condition, looking at the more local fires for me anyway. Here's Beachy Creek on 8/26. So it was a lightning ignition somewhere around August 16th. There was a lightning storm, and that lightning ignition storm actually covered much of California as well as Oregon and Washington. And so there was pretty significant distribution of ignitions all across the West Coast. Many of them suppressed successfully. But this one, being deep in Opal Creek Wilderness, was challenging the firefighters. I think they had about 500 firefighters on this right before the big blow up occurred. As well as there's this Lion's Head fire that was over on the Warm Springs, so far over on the east side, burning on the Warm Springs, just on the other flanks of Mount Jefferson. And you can see that in the bottom right corner there. But here we are, also ignited at the same time, so 8/16. So after about 10 days, this is what we're looking at. 10 days of spread, and the Beachy Creek fire had gone to all of 24 acres. Lion's Head, being on the drier east side, had grown to a much greater degree. So at this point, it's 3,060 acres. Well, on September 6th, so now we're another 10 or 11 days out. And the Beachy Creek in that amount of time had grown to all of 469 acres. And this is when they had about 500 firefighters working to manage that fire and suppress that fire. Meanwhile, the Lion's Head, being on the east side where conditions are much drier, had grown already to 17,290 acres by that date. You can see where their positions are here, burning up the flanks of Mount Jefferson, many fires surrounding that area, the biggest being the B&B complex from 2003. So lots of high fire prone area there. And then we see at this point is where we're getting into the onset of this wind event. And what did that precipitate with these two fires in particular is a massive blow up within 3 days. So 3 days time, it had grown together. So this is the acreage together. Those two fires had reached 310,550 acres within 3 days. So the preceding 20 days, you saw the Beachy Creek grow to all of 450 acres, and with the wind onset and the extra dry conditions that come with that, we see quite an explosion to 310,550 acres. And the Lion's Head fire is the one that's considered to have impacted the city or the community of Detroit, and all the way sitting here at the back end of the reservoir. And so this was about the end of that fire. So it came from all the way on the Warm Springs, all the way across to the west side, and impacted these fires. And it's something you see in these historical or approximate burn perimeters from early surveyors coming through back in the early 1900s. Is that many fires tend to slop over from the east side to the west side and impact it. But we had ignitions also, of course, down in the canyon from infrastructure that impacted Santiam Canyon, as well as the Beachy that was sitting here originally, that seems to have primarily migrated to the northwest and then merged with those ignitions that came off the infrastructure down in the canyon. And you can see here then, and many of you may have been directly impacted by this or driven up there. I've certainly spent my time up there to look around and taken some of my students, and you can see it sort of snaked into many of these communities and really negative consequences to them that they'll be recovering from for years to come. And the fires ultimately, after some period of time, didn't grow a whole lot more, but continued to spread a bit. But they were under that inversion, and of course on the west side, under our normal flows, we don't see massive growth of fires. And so they grew a bit more before they were finally suppressed. And as I had noted, these are the two fires here, the Beachy Creek and Lion's Head that we just took a look at. And just to the north of it, of course, was that Riverside fire that was ignited during this event and ultimately covered this large area just to the north of the Beachy Creek fire. Now, I've overlaid those perimeters just over what scientists believe is the fire history of this region. Here you see the blue being infrequent high severity fire regimes, greater than 200 years occurrence, mixing in with some what we refer to as moderately frequent or mixed severity fires that span anywhere from 50 to 200 years. So that gives us just a little historical perspective as to how fire used to operate prior to the European settlement here in the Western United States, where we've been effectively managing fire over the last century or so. And so there used to be much more fire, and we have now experienced one of those rare events, something that occurs on the order of every 200 years, at least in any given footprint. It's not that it couldn't burn next to it and occur next year in the same kind of sense, but typically within one area, you only experience that every couple hundred years. Now, as these are burning, of course, there's lots of fires burning all across the western flank of Oregon. These either threw out large spot fires into our suburban areas, so they even came out of the wildlands. And so these are just to the northwest of the Riverside fire. This is the reports you were hearing about Antifa starting fires or power line starting fires, or what may have just been very large and distant spot fires. These are the ones that we were hearing about up in Clackamas County, and really threatening many communities and farms throughout that. Fortunately, they were able to suppress these at a reasonably small size relative to those other large fires. But these, so all of a sudden we're starting to see these suburban fires, and what I really call the onset of these suburban fires. And those were some instances of it where the outcomes weren't as extreme. They weren't as extreme as the conditions we saw down in southern Oregon that were also impacted by the east side fires. So what you're seeing here are just satellite hotspots of the Alameda fire that burned just out of Ashland, Oregon, and into the communities of Talent and Phoenix. And this was the spread of that fire within 4 hours of its ignition, and an ignition that appears that is certainly human caused. How it transpired is a little bit uncertain right now. But that's where it started, approximately at a BMX park in Ashland, and spread very rapidly and very linearly right down the bottom of the valley along Interstate 5 through the Bear Creek Parkway, which is a bike path that runs between the two communities, actually all three of these communities, and in parts connecting all the way to Central Point. And then by later that evening, this is where the fire had spread to, and essentially where it had stopped. And you can see it was a real rapid spread, and it was an all effort, all hands on deck trying to evacuate people and trying to suppress the fire as well. And this is a footprint, and here you can see just an IR photo. So the red is the green vegetation, and then you can see the burn footprint. Very linear, following that wind vector that came through, because we had such a prominent east wind. It really narrowed that spread to this width, and really fast moving and into these communities where they lost thousands and thousands of homes. And here on the bottom, you can see this is my brother's home in Talent, Oregon, that he lost completely, and is now vacating and moving up here to the Willamette Valley, given the prominence of fire in that southwestern Oregon. But everybody's safe. They just lost all of their possessions, as well as this entire city block, plus some, and then more even in Phoenix, Oregon. Similarly, and buried in the news at best, is there was a fire occurring, the Echo Mountain fire over in Lincoln City. And I just drove through here the other day, but you can see this also pushing through a suburban or urban environment, ignited there and continued to spread through there. So 2,300 acres roughly, and of course impacts to the community as you would anticipate, as well as Otis Cafe for those of you that have driven out there and been out there, spent some time out there. And then thinking, of, I guess, sort of further south, but maybe in the middle of this, was the Holiday Farm fire. And here you can see the spread map from Oregon Department of Forestry that they created, that approximates how quickly this fire spread. Ignition being up here, as Holiday Farm would indicate, at the Holiday Farm Park, and then it spread rapidly down heavily through a mixed ownership landscape. It really impacted a lot of private industrial forests down here, some public lands. It's estimated about 65% of it being private industrial. So huge impacts to the timber industry. Many of you obviously recognize that. So this really had significant consequences on timber supply and timber control. And this is what it looks like from the air. So I took a flight of this sometime a couple days after the event. And what we're looking at here is Blue River, Oregon, right here in the center. And then the burn landscape around it, the ignition being up here, farther up the river. And it blew down. And you can see if you look at it, so this was early enough post-fire that those areas that are all black sticks like this, black trees, that's really indicative of active crown fire spreading. The areas with scorched crown and red would be a significantly and intense wildfire, but not burning actively through the crown. So the crowns are still intact, but they obviously have been killed. Or so you can, with that east wind event funneling down this canyon, you can really see how it caused the fire to run rapidly up those windward side slopes, and then some less consequences on the leeward side. But some significant impacts, not only to the communities, but to the private landowners around them as well. This is what it looked like on site in town, and then more out in the forest now, and looking at the impacts to some of the managed lands, and how the fire impacted those investments and that timber supply that's available out there. Going backwards now. And then another shot looking now towards the west, where you can see how this fire was really moving across this landscape in these really significant crown fires and impacting all levels of landscape. This being maybe the most obvious funneling of how strong that wind was and how well that wind really pushes the fire across the landscape. And you can see this topographically funneled wind is really moving through this little canyon here, which is the side canyon to the river, which is off to the left of the image. But we're now looking west, so the fire, this would be like looking at the back end of the fire as it moved across this landscape, running crown fires coming up on this windward side, a little bit dying down on the east side, and then picking up again and just seemingly skipping across this landscape and burning ultimately out here into a large chunk of Weyerhaeuser land that was heavily impacted. And I think they were at about 10% of their land base impacted by this, from what AJ Kroll has passed along to me. Here's a structure in a home that survived this fire despite the onslaught of these crown fires, because of having the right building materials and some good defensible space. And so, even in these conditions, homes can survive, but they have to be prepared and expectant of it. And of course, the fire was likely a bit more intense coming out of this very young plantation. So they may have been partially protected by that. But ultimately, this is just some stats. We don't need to read this. It's in the PowerPoint that you guys can look at any time in the future. We don't need to dwell on it, but there were significant fires, many human caused, but ultimately this summation of these fires, which is not a sum total of all in Oregon, but the ones you see here on this slide, is 912,000 acres impacted. And it really is impacting all Oregonians in this case, some way or another. And so with that, in order to leave some extra time, I will just go ahead and end there. I always use my kids as a reminder to stop talking about fire, as my wife would like me to do, probably even more often. But I want to leave some time for questions, and so I'm happy to do so. Thank you for the time.
Great, thank you, Chris. We've got one so far from, I think it's from Jane Brandenburg. Yep. So will these areas burn again soon? Do fires often start in the downed debris from the original fires?
That's a really interesting question. So To the first part of your question, will these areas burn again soon? That is not something that's all that predictable. Given our fire histories are saying, you know, any site might burn every, 50 to 200 years or 150 to 200 years, depending on whether you're in the high severity regime or the mixed severity regime. That would lead you to think that at least in those footprints, it may be quite some time before they burn again. That being said, there's some, it's not strong scientific evidence, but looking back in history and some of the historical accounts, there does seem to be some potential for reburn to occur in these environments, and therefore you may see more rapid reoccurrence in the coming days. Now, management was different back then, so I think the way we manage today may prevent some of that, but there's some accounts of fires burning just through gorse on the Coast Range, and if that's the type of response we see, or we see some other, Scots broom or significant, if it's not well protected, we could see an increase in burn probability as a result of these invasive species. But it's really hard to predict whether that will happen or not. They're low probability events. I would say it's very unlikely and remains unlikely. Now, that being the case, that's just the burned footprints that we're looking at. Much of the landscape wasn't burned, and they sit in the same state as they did last year before this event. Could we experience another east wind event next year? Yes, we could, but they're very low probability, so it's very unlikely. To the point of, do fires often start in down debris from the original fires? They do. The Tillamook fire reburned quite a bit through a lot of that slash and some of the examples I said before that seem to suggest there's an increased probability of ignition as a result of that down debris. Certainly wood, as it begins to decay, is a good receptor of embers coming from elsewhere. And so they can be pretty reasonable receptors and then spreaders from there. And so that is a potential. I was talking with some fire folks yesterday down in southwestern Oregon. We were talking about the benefits of prescribed fire at protecting, other resources from fire, because they create these great boundaries. And they were talking about trying to suppress a large fire in southwestern Oregon, and they were leveraging a recent prescribed fire. And he said that they had an onslaught of embers, and it caught all the stumps from a previous treatment, but they didn't spread anywhere because of the burned areas around it. So the debris was receptive of it, and then it depends on what's in between those spaces as to whether it continues to spread and cause additional damage.
Great. A couple more. Sean Hart asks, how long do you think landowners with harvestable timber in the burned areas on the west side, maybe up to Santiam and McKenzie, have before bugs move in and reduce merchantability?
Wow, I would guess that most of you have a better answer to this than me. I'm not much of an entomologist, but I think it's pretty clear that insects arrive. Well, as a firefighter, I'll say I can remember being attacked by the onslaught of insects, smelling the smoke. And so they are arriving as quickly as the fire is going out. Certain insects are, so it depends on the type that you're concerned with. And so we as firefighters are always pulling off insects that are biting our necks and things like that. And so they're there rapidly. And as far as pine beetles or borers and those sorts of things, I think they're going to be in within a year. And that's why salvage programs try to be so fast and so quick at it, so that they can prevent mass spread of those. And so I would expect you would see those by the spring starting to develop pretty significantly. And I welcome any of you experts out there to also comment on that if you have a different take on that.
Okay. Dave Ehlers asks, what stand ages seem most affected, if at all?
Well, during those wind events, it didn't really matter at all. That's what's becoming evident, that because it's such a strong wind and it's so dry, the conditions that are brought with those east winds, that the fires just plowed through, whether it was old growth or a managed plantation stand. It seemed to be generally irrelevant what those conditions are. And that's under those really east wind events. We can't expect that there's going to be much that can be, I guess we're not gaining a lot by management to prevent under these type of conditions. They're just so extreme that it's something that's basically unstoppable during the event. Now, things can change as the fire calms down on the fringes, of course. And so fire's not always just explosive like that, but under those explosive conditions, it seems to be that most forest conditions were lost.
Great. One more so far. Mike Cossie asks, would a vigorous prescribed burning program reduce these kinds of fires?
Sure. You know, it's sort of, but that's sort of an answer is like, you know, if we paved the forest, would we get more water? Yeah, we could do that, but the amount of prescribed burning and that you would have to do and how often you would have to do that in these highly productive forest ecosystems far exceeds something that is financially or operationally feasible, I would think, in my opinion. That particularly for understanding for these type of fire events. Could it be done? Sure, but it would be on such a scale that I don't think it's socially or operationally feasible to do so. And that's an important consideration. It's a bit different in east side forests where the, you know, or the dry forest environments southwest where there's less, you know, the forests are so much less productive and burning conditions are so much more frequent that you could probably get to a scale to protect private industrial forests, small woodland owners, or state forests by doing a vigorous prescribed burning program all across that and maintain some level of resilient forests on that landscapes.
Outstanding. Now, I'm not seeing any more. Maybe one of our other board members or panelists has a question they'd like to say out loud. Otherwise, it's 7:29 and getting pretty close to the end of that agenda.
Nancy Hathaway asked one in the Q&A.
Oh, excellent. Would a sustained program of spring and fall herbicide sprays help control fire for first 6 or so years? Actually, Nancy's husband, Greg Peterson.
It got a little broken there, but I think it was, so essentially we're talking about control of fuel, right? And so I think there's some opportunity there. I don't know, it's not well explored in the science, so I don't have any say from that perspective. But you know, with fire spread, and there was a recent paper that just came out, I guess maybe even today or yesterday, a real physics-based model, and you're looking at fire spread amongst your planted forest, your crowns. As they interlock, there's easy transmission across that. So if you have a fire that, you know, a fire wave that comes into your forest land and it hits it, and you have that uniform fuel bed, it can spread pretty regularly across that. And so if you're using herbicides treatments to maintain some interspace and some discontinuity in that crown fire during that first 6 years, yeah, I think there's an opportunity that it could be effective at helping with that onslaught of fire. But you still would have to also address the surface fuel loadings, and that may be the slash that came post-harvest, as well as any grass or others that's burning during that to help prevent any lift from the ground of fire into the canopies as well. So I don't know if it's herbicide gets you 100% there, but I think it can help pretty significantly in that transmission of fire from tree to tree during that early period.
Great.